The muffled sound of a carriage halting outside 221B Baker Street drew Watson's attention away from his medical journal. A moment later, a knock echoed through the apartment. When Mrs. Hudson admitted the visitor, a striking woman in a morning dress stepped forward, her face pale and tear-streaked. "I am Lady Eleanor Ashcroft," she began, her voice trembling as she clutched a velvet purse. "My husband, Lord Richard Ashcroft, is dead. They say it was suicide, but I know—" Her words faltered, and she gripped the back of a chair for support. Holmes rose, his keen gaze sweeping over her. "Pray, sit down, Lady Eleanor. Take your time, and tell us what brings you to me." Watson, always empathetic, poured a glass of water and pressed it into her hand. She drew a shaky breath. "Richard was found in his study yesterday morning. A dagger, a grotesque thing from India, was buried in his chest. The coroner believes it was self-inflicted, but Richard would never—" Her voice broke again. The study door was locked, and none of the servants saw or heard anything unusual. Holmes leaned forward, his steepled fingers resting against his lips. "Your arrival suggests you suspect foul play. What is it you wish me to uncover?" Lady Eleanor looked at him desperately. "The truth, Mr. Holmes. I need to know who killed my husband and why." Holmes's sharp eyes flickered with interest. "The truth, my lady, rarely hides for long. Tell me everything you can about the events leading up to his death." As they traveled by carriage to the Ashcroft estate, Watson could not help but admire Holmes's calm demeanor. Lady Eleanor sat across from them, wringing her hands. "It seems improbable," Watson remarked, breaking the silence. "A locked door, no intruders, and a man dead by his own hand. What else could it be but suicide?" Holmes cast him a sidelong glance. "Improbable, Watson, but not impossible. Locked room mysteries often hinge on the simplest of details. Details we shall uncover." Upon arrival, the butler ushered them into the somber study. The heavy oak door, now ajar, bore a sturdy lock. The room was dimly lit, with curtains drawn and the faint scent of sandalwood lingering in the air. Holmes surveyed the scene, his sharp eyes missing nothing. The desk bore signs of disturbance. Papers scattered, an ink pot overturned. Most notable was the ornate dagger still embedded in the wooden writing surface, its wicked blade gleaming. Lady Eleanor hesitated at the threshold. No one could have entered or left that room without being seen. The staff are loyal, and Richard himself locked the door every evening. Please, Mr. Holmes, you must see there's more to this than meets the eye." Holmes nodded, his gaze fixed on the dagger. "Indeed, my lady. The locked door narrows our options, but it does not close the case. The devil is often in the details." Holmes moved swiftly, his hands deftly inspecting every inch of the study. Watson stood by, noting the methodical way Holmes approached the scene, as if piecing together a silent puzzle. "The dagger," Holmes murmured, gesturing for Watson to observe. "Notice the angle at which it was thrust. This was no haphazard act. The blade was driven deliberately, with strength and precision." Watson frowned. But if it were murder, how could the culprit escape a locked room? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he crouched near the desk, examining a faint scorch mark and the subtle residue of ash on the floor. "Incense," he said, almost to himself. "A ritual of sorts, or a means to mask another odor?" He pocketed a small sample in a glass vial. His attention then turned to the scattered papers. Among them lay an unfinished letter, the ink smudged but legible. "To my dearest Eleanor," Holmes read aloud. "There is much I must confess, but time is short." The letter ended abruptly, as if Lord Ashcroft had been interrupted mid-thought. Finally, Holmes's eyes narrowed on the lock itself. He ran a finger along the brass mechanism and inspected the hinges. "Curious," he muttered, rising. "What have you found?" Watson asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "Enough to suggest that this dagger has a story of its own. A story we shall unravel in due time. Holmes sat with Lady Eleanor in the drawing-room of the Ashcroft estate, his sharp gaze unwavering as she recounted her late husband's recent endeavors. Watson, seated nearby, scribbled notes in his journal, his brow furrowed in concentration. Richard had grown secretive these past months. Lady Eleanor began hesitantly, her hands clasping a delicate lace handkerchief. He spent long hours in his study, corresponding with figures I never met. He received parcels from India, always locked away without explanation. Holmes nodded, his expression inscrutable. And these correspondences, my lady, did you ever glimpse their nature? No, she admitted, her voice trembling. But I suspect they concerned his business ventures. He had investments in Indian trade, though he rarely discussed them with me. Holmes turned to the butler, who had been standing silently near the door. You, sir, what can you tell us of Lord Ashcroft's demeanor in recent days? The butler, a stately man with silvered hair, cleared his throat. My lord seemed troubled, sir. Restless at night. Once I overheard him speaking to himself, mentioning something about a curse. A curse? Watson interjected, his pen pausing mid-stroke. The butler nodded gravely. Yes, doctor. Something about an object he acquired. An artifact of ill repute. Holmes leaned forward, his interest visibly piqued. Did any among the staff notice unusual visitors or receive peculiar instructions from Lord Ashcroft? The butler hesitated. There was a man, sir, a courier of sorts. He delivered a package the night before my lord's death and left in great haste. Curious, Holmes murmured, rising abruptly. Watson, it seems we must delve deeper into Lord Ashcroft's dealings. The answers lie not only in this house but in the shadows of his past. As they returned to 221B Baker Street, Watson marveled at Holmes's ability to gather threads of a mystery with such precision. The detective sat opposite him, eyes closed and fingers steepled, as though lost in a labyrinth of thought. I cannot help but notice your growing fascination with this case, Watson ventured. What is it about Lord Ashcroft's death that intrigues you so? Holmes opened his eyes, a faint smile playing on his lips. Consider the elements, Watson. A ceremonial dagger from a distant land, whispers of curses, and the locked room in which a man of wealth and influence met his end. It is not the mundane tragedy it appears to be. Watson nodded, his curiosity piqued. And the incense, the unfinished letter, do they not suggest something ritualistic? Indeed, Holmes replied, his gaze sharpening. The burnt incense masks more than mere odor. It obscures motive. And the letter, cut short, hints at a revelation Lord Ashcroft sought to impart before his demise. We must determine whether he intended to confess a secret or warn of a danger. Holmes's fingers drummed rhythmically against his knee. The courier mentioned by the butler intrigues me. What manner of package warranted such haste? And why did its arrival precede death by mere hours? You suspect the courier delivered the dagger? Watson asked. Holmes inclined his head. Perhaps, but suspicion alone is insufficient. We must ascertain the nature of the delivery, the identity of the sender, and the implications of Lord Ashcroft's dealings in India. Only then will the fog surrounding this case begin to lift. Watson watched as Holmes's eyes gleamed with determination. It was in such moments, amidst the quiet hum of thought, that Watson was reminded of the brilliance that set his friend apart. Holmes's piercing gaze swept over the dusty records in the East India Company's archives, his fingers tracing the margins of a faded map. Watson stood beside him, his brow furrowed with curiosity. They had spent hours combing through the papers, the silence between them thick with anticipation. Here, Holmes murmured, his voice low as he pulled a single document from the stack. It was a correspondence from Lord Ashcroft to an unnamed scholar in India, detailing extensive research into a ceremonial dagger. Seems our late friend had an obsession with this artifact, Holmes continued, his brow knitted in concentration. "The letter speaks of a legend, that the dagger, when in the hands of its rightful owner, reveals truths of the soul, secrets buried deep within the heart." Watson's mind raced. "You're suggesting Lord Ashcroft was investigating this dagger because he believed in its powers?" Holmes nodded, his eyes glinting with a mixture of skepticism and intrigue. Indeed, the belief that it could expose one's hidden truths could explain much of his recent behavior. But I suspect he sought something more, something darker. The question remains: what truths did he hope to unearth, and at what cost? They continued their search, unearthing fragments of Ashcroft's correspondence with an ancient scholar who had been rumored to have studied the legend for years. A chilling thought crept into Watson's mind. Could the dagger have been more than just a symbol? Could it have been a tool for uncovering a past so terrible that even Lord Ashcroft had feared it? Holmes turned to Watson, his expression unreadable. "Let us speak to the servants next. They may hold the final pieces of the puzzle." The more Holmes delved into the legend, the more it began to consume him. As they pored over the historical texts, he pieced together the full scope of the tale. The dagger, a sacred relic from an ancient Indian kingdom, was said to reveal the hidden truths of any who wielded it. However, the revelations came at a price. The bearer would be forced to confront their darkest fears, the sins they had buried deep within. "The legend speaks of vengeance," Holmes said quietly, almost to himself. "It is said that the bearer of the dagger will uncover not only the truth, but also the guilt tied to it. Those who have wronged others cannot escape the wrath of the weapon's revelations." Watson frowned. "Do you believe Lord Ashcroft was seeking vengeance through the dagger?" Holmes's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, his eyes sparkling with an enigmatic understanding. "I believe Lord Ashcroft sought the truth, of his own soul, perhaps, or of something far more dangerous. But in his pursuit of revelation, he may have found a truth he could not bear. A truth, Watson, that led him to his untimely death." Watson paused, the implications of Holmes's words settling heavily on his shoulders. Could the dagger have driven Lord Ashcroft to madness, to some unspeakable act that led to his demise? The notion felt more terrifying by the second. The dagger may have exposed something so terrible, so deeply buried, that Ashcroft could no longer live with the knowledge, Holmes mused, his voice a mere whisper. "But we must uncover the truth, Watson. Only then can we understand the real danger this legend poses." The investigation took them back to Ashcroft Manor, where the air seemed thick with secrets. The servants were uneasy, casting furtive glances as Holmes and Watson questioned them about the events surrounding Lord Ashcroft's death. The butler, Mr. Collins, was the first to speak, his voice steady but his hands ringing nervously in his lap. "My lord, he was always in his study, always busy with papers. I never saw any unusual visitors, sir. But there was something odd." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Odd, you say? What precisely do you mean?" Collins hesitated. "There was a letter, sir, a strange letter, delivered in the night, and Lord Ashcroft seemed troubled after reading it. But he never spoke of it again." "Who delivered the letter?" Watson asked, his voice tinged with urgency. "I don't know, sir. A man, masked, though he never came inside. He handed the letter through the door, then left swiftly." Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson. "A masked messenger, and yet no one remembers a thing about him?" The housekeeper, Mrs. Baker, was next to be questioned. She claimed that on the night of the murder, the household had all been in their rooms, with the exception of Lord Ashcroft. But her alibi was weak, and Holmes knew better than to take it at face value. "The tension in this house is palpable, Watson," Holmes muttered as they walked the halls. "Each servant holds a secret, each one hiding something from us. It is only a matter of time before they reveal their true nature." As they continued their inquiries, Holmes's sharp mind began to piece together the inconsistencies in the servants' alibis. The house was locked from the inside, yet there were whispers of late-night visitors and strange happenings within its walls. Something far more sinister lurked beneath the surface, and Holmes was determined to uncover the truth. "It is clear, Watson," Holmes said. "The game is afoot, but we are not the only ones searching for answers in these shadows." The heavy wooden door to Lord Ashcroft's private study creaked open, its aged hinges protesting. Holmes entered the room first, with Watson close behind. Their previous investigation had yielded few answers, yet there was an undeniable sense that the truth lay hidden within these walls. Holmes's sharp eyes immediately sought out the small, secured safe behind the bookshelf. It was locked, but the methods for unlocking such devices were familiar to Holmes. Within moments, the door to the safe was open, revealing a collection of documents, but one ledger caught his attention. "This, Watson, is where the mystery deepens," Holmes muttered, his fingers delicately turning the pages of the ledger. The ledger was meticulous, filled with entries that appeared innocuous at first glance. However, as Holmes scanned the names and figures, his gaze tightened. "Payments, regular and substantial, to a party I cannot yet identify," he said quietly, his voice thick with intrigue. The entries were vague, with no clear recipient names, merely marked by initials and coded references. The sums involved were large, far larger than any ordinary business transaction. Holmes's finger hovered over one particularly cryptic entry. "Payment for service rendered, R.L. A.D. R.L. and A.D., Watson repeated, his brow furrowed. "Who are these people, Holmes?" "That is precisely the question, Watson. Whoever they are, their connection to Ashcroft is undeniable." Holmes closed the ledger with a finality that sent a cold shiver down Watson's spine. "This ledger holds secrets, Watson. Secrets that tie Lord Ashcroft to something far more dangerous than mere business dealings. We must learn who R.L. and A.D. truly are, and why Ashcroft paid them so handsomely." Holmes and Watson made their way to Lady Eleanor's private quarters, where the young widow sat, her face pale and tight with anxiety. She had been a source of information throughout the investigation, but Holmes knew there were still questions left unanswered. "Lady Eleanor," Holmes began, his tone soft but firm, "we must speak of your brother, Mr. George Hawke. His sudden departure from the household, it seems highly suspicious." Lady Eleanor's hands trembled as she clasped them in her lap. "George. He was dismissed, yes. But it was for his own good, Mr. Holmes. Lord Ashcroft, he had become increasingly distant, difficult. George was concerned." Watson exchanged a look with Holmes. "Difficult, you say? How so?" Lady Eleanor's eyes darted nervously toward the window, her voice barely above a whisper. "There were arguments, heated ones, but I cannot speak of the details. It's all too much." Holmes pressed, his voice colder now. "You must, Lady Eleanor. It is crucial to our investigation." The widow hesitated, then sighed. "My brother was dismissed without warning. No explanation, nothing. Lord Ashcroft's temper had grown erratic, and, I fear, it was not only my brother who noticed." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Who else noticed, Lady Eleanor? Whom did Lord Ashcroft offend?" The silence hung heavy in the air, but Lady Eleanor refused to answer further. Holmes could see the wall she had built, one of fear, perhaps, or guilt. But one thing was clear. Her brother's exile was part of something far more sinister. The evening fog clung thickly to the cobbled streets of London as Holmes and I ventured into the darker corners of the city. The air was damp with the promise of rain, and the gas lamps flickered like the fading embers of a dying fire. We moved in silence, our footsteps echoing in the narrow alleyways, a stark contrast to the bustle of the more civilized parts of town. Holmes led the way, his pace steady, though there was an air of impatience about him that I had come to recognize only in the most taxing of cases. The mystery of Lord Ashcroft's dagger weighed heavily upon him, and it was clear that whatever lay hidden in the shadows of this city's underbelly would not rest until he had unearthed it. "Watson," Holmes muttered, his voice low but urgent, "we are not merely hunting for a dagger. We are seeking the threads of something far darker, far older. It is here, in these forgotten corners, where the answers will be revealed." I could hear the tension in his voice, an emotion I had rarely observed in him. Holmes was ever so composed, yet something in this case, perhaps in the dagger itself, had unsettled him. We finally arrived at the dilapidated shop of a dealer known for his knowledge of rare and dangerous antiquities. The door creaked open, and we were greeted by the smell of dust and aged wood. The dealer, a frail-looking man with an air of nervousness, beckoned us inside with a single, trembling hand. Inside the shop, the dim light revealed shelves crammed with relics from across the globe, each one holding a silent story. The dealer motioned for us to sit, his eyes flickering with an unspoken fear. "I take it you are here about the dagger," he began, his voice cracking under the weight of his own words. "It is not a simple artifact, gentlemen. It is the legacy of a cursed sect from India, a group known for its ritualistic vengeance. Their belief was simple. Betrayal demanded retribution, and the dagger was their instrument of choice." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. And this sect? What was their purpose in forging such a weapon? The dealer swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he spoke. They believed the dagger could reveal the truth to its bearer, but at a terrible cost. The truth, it is often too much for the unprepared. It brings madness, despair, and, ultimately, death. The dealer paused, his gaze shifting nervously as if he expected the walls themselves to close in on him. The blade, once in the possession of its rightful owner, could not be used lightly. Whoever sought it was marked. Watson could feel the weight of the dealer's words pressing on his chest. There was something unsettling in the air, a thickening tension that clung to the room. Holmes, however, showed no outward sign of fear. He only leaned closer, his voice calm yet insistent. "And this dagger, where is it now?" The dealer hesitated, glancing toward the shadows in the far corner of the room. "It is said that such items are never truly lost, only hidden. I saw a dagger much like the one you seek not long ago. It was in the possession of Gregory Blake, Lord Ashcroft's business partner." I felt the air shift around us. Holmes, normally unflappable, froze for the briefest moment before he spoke. "Blake, you say? When?" The dealer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "A few weeks ago, perhaps longer. He came in, as he often did, to inspect rare pieces. He seemed particularly taken with that one. I warned him, of course. I told him the history of it, but he would not listen." Holmes's eyes flashed with understanding, his mind already working at a breakneck pace. "And where is Blake now?" The dealer's face darkened, his voice dropping. "Gone. Vanished. Just like the dagger. No one's seen him since that night. His place? It's as though the very walls swallowed him whole." A cold silence settled over the room. "That is most troubling," Holmes murmured, his gaze hardening. "It seems that the business partner's connection to this cursed relic is far more than mere coincidence." As we left the dealer's shop, the fog outside had thickened, shrouding London's streets in an almost suffocating embrace. Holmes's pace quickened, and I noticed for the first time a shift in his demeanor. He was not himself. His usual confidence was replaced by a growing unease, a silent preoccupation that weighed heavily on him. As we walked, I dared to ask, "Holmes, what troubles you so? You seem agitated." Holmes did not respond immediately. His mind, I knew, was working furiously, piecing together fragments of the case, drawing connections that I could not yet see. Finally he spoke, his voice low, tinged with something unfamiliar. "This is not just another case, Watson. The dagger, the curse, Blake's disappearance. They are all part of something far more intricate than I had anticipated. I feel it closing in, tightening like a noose around my neck. His words carried a weight that unsettled me. Holmes was rarely shaken, but this case had taken on a life of its own, and it was clear that he was no longer in control. "We must hurry," Holmes continued, his eyes scanning the streets as though he feared someone, or something, was watching us. "There is far more at stake than I had imagined." We arrived at Gregory Blake's residence later that evening, the mansion eerily quiet in the darkened streets. Holmes approached the door, his fingers brushing the handle as though testing for danger. It was locked, but he had the means to enter without force. The door creaked open and we stepped inside, greeted by the unsettling silence of the place. The atmosphere was heavy with the scent of something long abandoned. As we moved deeper into the house, it became painfully clear that the place had been thoroughly ransacked. Drawers lay open, papers scattered like leaves in a storm. Holmes moved quickly, his eyes scanning the wreckage, searching for anything that might provide a clue. His fingers traced over the marks of forced entry, the signs of a struggle. "Blake was here," Holmes murmured, his voice thick with frustration. "But now, he is gone." There were no signs of life, only the remnants of Blake's hurried departure. Holmes paused, his face grim. "This is no simple robbery. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for." As I examined the shattered remnants of the study, the grim realization settled in. Blake had disappeared, and whatever dark force had claimed him now seemed to be closing in on us. Holmes led me through the winding, dimly lit alleys of London's underbelly, the sound of our footsteps swallowed by the heavy fog that clung to the cobblestones. It was a world far removed from the stately offices of Scotland Yard or the comforts of Baker Street. In the midst of the damp air and the scent of decay, he spoke little, but I knew the intensity of his focus. There was something dangerous in his quiet determination. We arrived at a discreet tavern hidden amongst the shadows. Inside, amidst the murmur of low conversations and the clinking of glasses, we found our contact, a former informant, once a part of London's criminal fringe. His face was weathered by years of deceit and suspicion, but his eyes betrayed the knowledge he possessed. "Sherlock Holmes," he rasped, his voice thick with disdain. "You've come for more than mere idle chatter, I presume?" Holmes nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Tell me of the dagger and its ties to the Eben Veil." The man leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "A cursed object, if there ever was one. That dagger's origins lie with a shadowy syndicate, the Eben Veil. They specialize in retrieving artifacts of power for a price, no questions asked. Once they get their hands on something, they will stop at nothing to claim it." His words hung in the air, the weight of his revelation settling between us. The syndicate's name was a whisper on the streets, a specter no one dared confront. "Lord Ashcroft?" Holmes said, his voice steady. "Did he cross them?" The informant's eyes darted around the room, ensuring no one was listening. "Ashcroft?" "Aye, he made enemies in more places than one, but the Eben Veil, I wouldn't be surprised. They don't take kindly to defiance." The air thickened with the unsaid, and I could see that Holmes was already piecing the fragments together, his mind racing with the possibilities. As we left the tavern, the rain began to fall, a steady drumming on the stone pavement. Holmes was unusually silent, lost in thought. The pieces of the puzzle were now beginning to form a troubling picture. "Do you think Ashcroft's involvement with the Eben Veil was accidental?" I asked, walking alongside him. Holmes's sharp gaze flickered over to me for a moment before he replied. "Accidental? Hardly, Watson. A man like Ashcroft did not stumble into dealings with such a syndicate. He must have known the risks. But there is one thing I am certain of. Ashcroft underestimated them, and that has likely cost him his life." The cold air seemed to deepen the sense of dread that had been building between us. The Eben Veil was no ordinary criminal syndicate, They were an elusive, powerful force, and the very idea of Lord Ashcroft, one of the city's most influential men, crossing them was unsettling. But as Holmes's mind worked, I saw the grim understanding on his face. "He defied them, Watson," Holmes continued, his voice tinged with both frustration and determination. "And now we must discover what drove him to do so, and what the price of that defiance truly was." I could not help but feel the heavy weight of his words. The deeper we delved, the more perilous this investigation became. Back at Baker Street, as the fire crackled in the hearth, I began to sift through Lord Ashcroft's personal effects, papers, documents, and letters, all of which offered little more than a surface-level glimpse into the man's life. But one letter caught my eye. It was sealed with a wax crest I had not seen before, an intricate design that bore no immediate recognition. "Holmes," I called, my voice strained with a sense of urgency. "You may want to see this." Holmes approached, his eyes immediately narrowing in on the letter as I handed it to him. He turned it over in his hands, studying the seal with a keen interest before breaking the wax. "What have you found?" he asked, his tone sharpening. The letter was short, its language cryptic. It contained nothing overtly sinister, but the final few lines, written in a hurried script, struck me with a chill. "I will meet him at midnight. The location is hidden in the cipher." Holmes's expression shifted as he examined the letter further. His lips barely moved as he muttered, "A cipher." He handed it back to me. "Watson, I need your assistance. It appears we have a secret meeting to unravel." Hours passed as Holmes pored over the letter, his eyes darting back and forth across the page, his brow furrowed in concentration. His mind was working at a fevered pace, and the sense of urgency hung in the air like a storm cloud. "Ah!" Holmes finally exclaimed, his voice tinged with triumph. "It's quite simple, really. A simple letter substitution cipher. Each letter is replaced by the one that follows it in the alphabet." I watched in awe as Holmes swiftly decoded the message, his fingers dancing across the paper. Within moments, the cryptic words became clear. "The rendezvous is set for midnight at the old clock tower by Westminster," Holmes said, his voice barely a whisper, as though the very mention of it might summon danger. I felt a shiver run down my spine. A meeting at midnight. The secrecy, the cryptic messages, it all pointed to something far darker than we had imagined. The clock struck 10 as we made our preparations, the city of London lying in wait beneath a blanket of mist. The chill in the air seemed to press in on us, as though the darkness itself was alive, watching our every move. "Holmes, are you certain we should go?" I asked, my voice betraying my concern. "This could be a trap." Holmes's eyes gleamed with a quiet intensity. "It is a risk we must take, Watson. The answers we seek lie within that clock tower, and tonight we will discover them." As we made our way toward Westminster, the sense of danger heightened with every step. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual hum of London's nightlife subdued by the weight of what was to come. We were nearing the clock tower when the midnight bell tolled, echoing through the fog. This meeting, this rendezvous, was bound to reveal something monumental. But as Holmes and I stood at the threshold of the clock tower, I could not shake the sense that we were on the verge of something far more dangerous than we had prepared for. The evening was clouded with the heaviness of anticipation as Holmes and I made our way to a dreary part of London. A small, decaying boarding house loomed before us, its sagging windows and chipped paint telling tales of neglect and forgotten lives. We were here to find Charles, Lady Eleanor's estranged brother. Though once a man of privilege, he had become a shadow of his former self, now hiding among those far removed from society's upper echelons. Holmes moved with a purpose, his steps measured, his eyes sharp. The dismal street smelled of damp and decay, and I felt a slight shiver as the damp fog curled around us. Holmes led us to the door, which creaked ominously as we entered. Inside, the boarding house was barely lit, The stench of stale tobacco and unwashed bodies thick in the air. Charles sat hunched in a dim corner, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously at our approach. He knew why we were here, and the moment his gaze met Holmes's, I could sense his unease. Holmes wasted no time. "Mr. Charles, I trust you are prepared to speak the truth now?" Charles shifted uncomfortably, avoiding our eyes, but the tension in the room was palpable. Whatever secrets he held were clawing at him, and I could see that he knew it was time to divulge them. Charles shifted uneasily, wringing his hands. I didn't want to get involved, but I had no choice. His voice quivered as he recalled the events that had happened just days before his brother-in-law's death. I overheard them. Lord Ashcroft and a man, a stranger. The argument was fierce. Ashcroft was terrified. I leaned forward, my curiosity piqued. What was said? Charles hesitated, but then relented. The man. He threatened Ashcroft. He said that there were consequences for crossing them, that Ashcroft had gone too far. He paused, swallowing hard. I couldn't make sense of it. But the man, he wasn't just any visitor. He wasn't even English, I'm sure of it. "Do you remember what else was said?" Holmes pressed, his voice calm but insistent. Charles's brow furrowed in concentration. "Only one thing. He said Ashcroft would pay the price, that the Eben Veil would make him regret his defiance." At that name, I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine. Holmes's face remained unreadable, but his mind was clearly working, piecing together yet another fragment of the puzzle. Holmes's expression hardened as Charles spoke the words that had once only been whispers in the darker corners of London. "The Eben Veil," Holmes murmured, almost to himself. "A name that many fear to utter aloud." The implications were grave. The Eben Veil was a shadowy syndicate, a network of criminals and mercenaries who dealt in artifacts, secrets, and lives. They operated in the underworld, invisible yet omnipresent, and their influence stretched further than anyone dared acknowledge. They dealt in power and had a reputation for ruthlessness that even the most hardened men feared. "A syndicate, you say?" I asked, trying to make sense of the notion. But Lord Ashcroft was a respected man. Why would they target him? Holmes's eyes narrowed, and I could see the gears turning in his mind. "That, Watson, is exactly what we must uncover. Ashcroft must have crossed them in some way, defied their interests. They would not have taken kindly to that." He turned to Charles, his voice now sharp. "You've provided us with the final piece, Mr. Charles. Now, we must follow this trail to its end." The night had fallen heavy, cloaking the streets in an oppressive silence. Holmes and I stood concealed in the shadows, awaiting the moment to strike. The location from Ashcroft's letter had led us to a forgotten warehouse near the docks, a place steeped in secrecy. We were to stake out this site, where Holmes believed further answers awaited us. The sound of distant footsteps echoed in the alley, punctuating the stillness. Holmes was as composed as ever, his eyes scanning every movement, every shadow. I felt a growing sense of unease as the minutes stretched into hours, and the air grew thick with expectation. "Patience, Watson," Holmes murmured, his tone quiet but firm. "The answer lies within these walls." A creak of a door pierced the silence, followed by the low murmur of voices. Holmes's posture stiffened, and I could feel the tension in the air as we prepared to make our move. But just as Holmes made a signal to advance, the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. Too loud, too deliberate. Before we could react, figures emerged from the darkness surrounding us. A trap. A scramble for survival ensued as Holmes and I were forced to flee. The fog seemed to grow thicker, swallowing the streets whole as we sprinted through the labyrinth of London's alleyways. The clatter of boots behind us echoed like a drumbeat, urging us onward. I glanced over at Holmes, who ran with his usual composure, his mind clearly calculating their every move. "We must not be caught, Watson," he urged, his voice carrying above the din of pursuit. "Their reach is far, and we cannot afford to be captured." The sounds of our footsteps were muffled by the thick fog, but the pursuit was relentless. We dodged corners, ducked through narrow passageways, and vaulted over crates as the operatives of the Eben Veil closed in. At last, a figure ahead of us faltered, a lone operative who had broken off from the others. Holmes, with his unrivaled agility, seized the opportunity. In an instant, he pounced, pinning the operative to the ground, his hands expertly securing the man's wrists. The operative's breath came in ragged gasps as Holmes stood over him, his eyes cold and calculating. But it was the glint of metal in the operative's coat that drew my attention. Holmes's hand shot out, retrieving a dagger, a twin to the one that had been used to kill Lord Ashcroft. Holmes's gaze met mine, and I saw the grim realization settle in. "The Eben Veil's hand is far more involved in this than we could have imagined," he muttered. "The game has only just begun." And with that, the chilling truth began to unfurl before us as we prepared for the next step in this perilous pursuit. The dimly lit room echoed with the sounds of silence, save for the occasional shuffling of papers and the creaking of a chair. Sherlock Holmes sat opposite the bound operative, his eyes sharp, his mind already processing the fragments of information he had gathered. The man, disheveled and bruised, had not uttered a word since his capture. Yet Holmes' silence was more daunting than any question. "I trust you know why you're here," Holmes finally spoke, his voice smooth but firm, with an edge that conveyed no mercy. The man stiffened but remained silent, his eyes darting about the room. Watson, standing nearby, noticed the tension in the air. He had seen Holmes interrogate countless criminals, but there was something uniquely chilling about the way Holmes approached this one. It wasn't merely the operative's capture that rattled him, it was the mystery surrounding the daggers. "Perhaps you'd prefer to avoid the inevitable," Holmes continued, leaning in slightly, "but I think you'll find it quite unwise. Tell me, who does the second dagger belong to?" The operative's eyes flickered and he swallowed. Holmes's gaze never wavered. "It's a symbol," the man whispered, his voice hoarse. "A pair. One represents justice, the other vengeance." Holmes's eyes gleamed with recognition. "And Lord Ashcroft, he possessed the first dagger, didn't he? Why?" The man shifted uncomfortably but nodded. "That's what you'll tell me now, my friend," Holmes urged, his tone turning sharper. "The truth behind the twin daggers. Who else sought them, and why?" The operative hesitated, then, as though knowing his fate was sealed, finally spoke. "They were part of a pact, a deadly pact. Lord Ashcroft had the first, but he was unwilling to part with it, even when the price was steep." The operative's words hung in the air, thick with tension. Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers in thought, as Watson exchanged a glance with him. This was the missing piece. "You claim Lord Ashcroft had a pact?" Holmes pressed. "Who was he bargaining with?" "The Eben Veil," the operative muttered, his face grim. "He had dealings with them, promised them something precious in exchange for the dagger. But he broke the promise, and for that they sought retribution." Holmes's mind whirred as he pieced together the implications. "A rare artifact, no doubt," Holmes mused, speaking more to himself than to the operative. "And he thought it worth more than his life?" The man nodded again, his voice laced with regret. "A rare artifact. Something of immense value. Lord Ashcroft swore to relinquish it, but in the end he couldn't. He had to keep it for himself. The veil. They don't forgive such things." Watson's brow furrowed. "So the Syndicate was involved in his death, but they didn't kill him?" "No," the operative replied, shaking his head. "Not directly, but they had their hand in it, every step of the way." Holmes turned his full attention back to the operative, the puzzle pieces falling into place. And that hand led straight to Lady Eleanor. As the operative's confession lingered in the air, Holmes's mind worked swiftly, unraveling the web of deception that had ensnared them all. Watson, sensing Holmes's intensity, stepped closer, drawn into the complexity of the case. "The artifacts, the daggers, the veil," Holmes murmured aloud, piecing the timeline together. Lord Ashcroft's acquisition of the first dagger, his refusal to yield the artifact, all while Lady Eleanor stood by, fearing the ruin of her husband's actions. She feared the Syndicate, the exposure. Watson's gaze narrowed, his instincts aligning with Holmes's deductions. And so, Ashcroft's death wasn't a random act of violence, it was meticulously planned. Precisely. Holmes's eyes glinted as he continued. The Eben Veil, using Ashcroft's greed to entrap him. They knew he'd never keep his word, and yet he never saw their retribution coming. But then, neither did Lady Eleanor, though she likely feared it every day. She knew the Syndicate's power. Holmes stood, pacing, his sharp movements almost a dance of intellectual fervor. Her desperation, her fear of scandal, no doubt drove her to act. She had to act before Lord Ashcroft's indiscretions became public knowledge. Watson watched as Holmes's deduction came to its inevitable conclusion. Lady Eleanor killed him. To protect herself and her reputation? Indeed, Holmes replied, but not just that. She was terrified of what would happen if the veil took its vengeance, and perhaps she thought by eliminating Ashcroft, she could control her own fate. Holmes's voice softened, his eyes distant as he pieced together the tragedy that had led to Lord Ashcroft's death. Watson knew the story would soon take a darker turn. Lady Eleanor was no stranger to the darkness that lingered over her household, Holmes said, his voice laced with both pity and condemnation. Her marriage, built on deceit, had already left her morally compromised, but it was the threat of ruin, of public scandal, that truly drove her to the edge. Watson frowned, his brow furrowed with concern. "You believe she killed her husband in cold blood, Holmes?" Holmes looked at Watson, his gaze unwavering. "She did. But it was not a matter of cold calculation, Watson. It was a matter of desperation. She feared what would happen when the Syndicate came for her, and when she realized she had no other choice, when her options had dwindled to nothing, she struck." Holmes's words were heavy, and for a moment Watson understood the weight of what they were about to uncover. "You think she believed her husband's death would stop the Syndicate?" "Perhaps," Holmes said with a grim finality, "but she underestimated the depths of the veil's reach." The hour had come. Holmes and Watson stood at the threshold of Lady Eleanor's study, the quiet before the storm. Watson felt a heavy unease settle in his chest. Holmes, ever composed, approached the matter with calm precision. "Lady Eleanor, I have gathered the facts, and it is time for you to answer." The lady's eyes darted nervously, her breath shallow. Holmes held out the twin daggers, their gleaming surfaces reflecting the harsh light of truth. "You killed your husband, Lady Eleanor," Holmes said without hesitation, "not for any grand political reason, but to secure your own safety. You feared the Syndicate's wrath and took the only action you believed could save you." For a long, agonizing silence, Lady Eleanor remained still, as though the weight of the truth were too much to bear. Then, with a trembling voice, she whispered, "Yes, I did." As the confession hung in the air, Holmes turned to Watson, his face a mixture of grim satisfaction and solemn reflection. "Justice," Holmes remarked, "has a peculiar way of unraveling itself." Yet, in this case, there was little justice for those whose lives were taken by deceit and desperation. Watson nodded solemnly. "And what of Lady Eleanor?" Holmes sighed, his expression one of resignation. Her actions were unforgivable, but they were driven by fear. The law will have its course. As for the rest, we shall see what becomes of the Eben Veil. The case, once shrouded in darkness, had finally found its conclusion, but the shadows of its truth lingered in the silence that followed. The cell was cold, and the air inside it seemed to echo with the silent cries of those who had come before her. Lady Eleanor Ashcroft stood before the constable, her eyes empty yet resigned to the truth she could no longer deny. The chains that now bound her were but a small reflection of the darker ties she had forged through her own betrayal. She had been a woman of remarkable beauty, but now, in the dim light of the prison, her features appeared drawn, as though the weight of her conscience had aged her decades in mere days. Sherlock Holmes stood beside me, his usual stoic expression unfaltering, yet I could see the faintest furrow of his brow. As we left the scene, I could not help but hear the muffled sound of Lady Eleanor's sobs, softened by the thick walls. Her actions, born from desperation, had destroyed everything she once held dear. Her husband's death, her role in the cover-up, all now unraveled by Holmes's keen mind. Her motives were clearer than I had imagined, Holmes said, his voice softer than usual. Fear and a sense of inevitability drove her to commit the act. She could not bear the thought of being ruined by her husband's dealings with those in the shadows. But the dagger, I questioned, unsure if his thoughts had turned once again to the weapon that had brought the case to its tragic end. Holmes's eyes darkened slightly, his gaze distant. The dagger was but a symbol. Its true power was not in the blade, but in the lies it fostered. I did not press further. There was nothing more to say. Lady Eleanor's fate had been sealed, and with it, a piece of the truth had come to light. As we walked away from the prison, Holmes seemed lost in thought, as if the weight of the case still clung to him. "The dagger," he murmured. "It speaks to something deeper than mere vengeance or justice." He turned to me with an intensity that made me pause. "Do you recall what the captive said about its twin?" I nodded, recalling the words of the Syndicate operative. He spoke of two daggers, one to symbolize justice, the other to symbolize vengeance. Holmes's voice grew more contemplative as we continued our walk through the fog-laden streets of London. Justice and vengeance, Watson. They are not merely abstract concepts. They are tools, wielded by human hands, manipulated by the desires and failings of those who hold them. The daggers were forged as instruments of retribution, but in the end, they became symbols of corruption. I watched Holmes closely, sensing that this case had unsettled him more than he had let on. He was rarely one to dwell on the moral implications of a case, but this one, this dagger, had clearly affected him. And yet, it was the promise of the dagger that sealed Lord Ashcroft's fate, was it not? I ventured. "Indeed," Holmes replied, his voice heavy with the knowledge of its tragic significance. "He refused to relinquish what was promised to the Syndicate. A man like him, bound by pride and greed, could never have understood the power of that symbol until it was too late." The air seemed to grow thicker as Holmes's words lingered, and I found myself wondering if the dagger had somehow become more than just a tool. Perhaps, in the hands of the wrong people, it had become something far more dangerous. We had returned to our quarters, and I could see that Holmes was once again lost in the tangled web of the case. As he sat in his chair, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the armrest, I could sense that something was gnawing at him, something far deeper than the resolution of Lady Eleanor's guilt. I could not help but ask, "Holmes, you seem disturbed. This case has clearly affected you more than usual." For a moment, he did not answer, his mind clearly elsewhere. Then, with a sigh, he met my gaze. "It is not the case that troubles me, Watson, but the constant reminder that justice is often no more than a fragile illusion. Lady Eleanor sought to avoid the consequences of her actions, but in doing so, she perpetuated a cycle of lies. The dagger, once a symbol of justice, became a harbinger of her undoing." I considered his words, but there was something more to them, something I could not quite grasp. "Holmes, is it possible that you feel conflicted about justice? You've always pursued it with relentless certainty." His eyes flickered, and for the briefest of moments I caught a glimpse of something more personal in them. "Perhaps it is not justice I seek, Watson, but rather the pursuit of its elusive truth." his gaze turned inward. For in that pursuit, I have come to realize that justice often comes at a cost, a price we are not always willing to pay. His words hung heavy in the room, and I wondered, not for the first time, if Holmes's relentless pursuit of truth was rooted in something far more personal, a need for justice he could never fully obtain. As I sat at my desk, pen in hand, I began to document the details of the case, the peculiarities, the intricacies, and the devastating truth that had come to light. Holmes's mind had once again triumphed over the shadows that clouded the truth, but even as I wrote, I felt a lingering uncertainty. Holmes had always been the rational one, driven by logic and reason, but in this case I could not help but wonder if there had been more at play. The dagger, the symbols of justice and vengeance, and the tragic ending that had resulted from a single act of desperation, they all pointed to something deeper. As I wrote, I thought about the complexities of human nature. Lady Eleanor's fear had led her to murder, yet the object of her terror had been nothing more than the pressure of maintaining appearances. Lord Ashcroft, too, had been a victim of his own choices that had ultimately destroyed him. And yet, as I captured the final words of the case, I realized that the resolution was far from complete. Justice had been served, but it was a justice marked by moral ambiguity, a justice that left more questions than answers. As I put down my pen, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps approaching. Holmes entered the room, holding a letter, its envelope sealed in crimson wax. His eyes narrowed as he looked at it. "It has arrived," he said, his voice colder than I had ever heard it. I stepped closer, instinctively sensing that something was wrong. "What is it, Holmes?" "A warning," he replied, his tone measured yet filled with an unsettling weight. "From the Eben Veil." The cryptic letter, with its cryptic markings, sent a chill down my spine. The Eben Veil had remained a shadow in the corners of our investigations, a network whose true motives and reach were still shrouded in mystery. Holmes read the letter in silence, his face a mask of concentration. "They are not finished with me," he said softly, almost to himself. "The game is far from over." As I watched him, I could not shake the feeling that the final chapter of this case was merely the beginning of something far more dangerous. The Eben Veil had not forgotten, and neither, it seemed, had Holmes's own past.